I am here with Dr. Georgie Gardiner, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Tennessee. Hi, Dr. Gardiner.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's going to be our pleasure. You're going to talk to us about testimony. And I see that like root word of testimony and so many other words. Can you try to explain like where does that word come from?
Yeah, so testimony, testing a person or testing a claim. Yeah, so testimony is basically when somebody says something. And it doesn't have to be vocal, it doesn't have to be spoken. It could be something that they've written down or used some other signal, but typically it's spoken. And so in a really standard case, that would be like, I believe a claim. We can call that claim, sort of like that the film starts at 6 and I want you to believe it. So I tell you the film starts at 6. So that's standard testimony. But of course, in real life, like a lot of testimony is more complicated than that because there's things like intonation. How is the thing said? And also implication. What do we imply? So if I say something like, oh, I saw Bill and Laura, they weren't fighting. That suggests a lot. What I've actually said is they weren't fighting. It's consistent with their getting along lovely, in a lovely way. But it suggests there was some tension or some history of fighting or something, some implications there. And there's also presuppositions. So I could say, well, they seem to be getting along well these days. Sort of presupposes that they didn't used to. It doesn't say it explicitly. And there's lots of editorial choices. So what do I say and what do I not say? What do I draw attention to? And what do I think you already know and that you should know and that you don't know? So it's a very rich area. And then there's all these questions of narrative. So how, when it's not just one claim, but it's a story, how is that story strung together? How do we editorialize those stories? So it's a really rich area for philosophy to think about how testimony works.
When we say testimony, are we including all those different facets or features that you just mentioned?
Yeah.
So it's not just the words, it's also everything you just said.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody says, that they study testimony, very often what they're talking about is just the words. But really to get the richer picture, the fuller picture of what's going on with the philosophy of testimony, we do need to include all of these other things. Like what kinds of topics are not being spoken about and not being attended to? What kinds of things do we assume the other person knows? Or what do we take for granted as background knowledge? Do I take for granted as background knowledge that couples usually get along well, or that this particular couple has not been getting along well, and that kind of thing? So it's a really rich area, and it isn't just amounting to the particular words that are said. It's all of these important background conditions. Yeah.
So let's apply this apparently very rich concept of testimony to the courts system in America. So sometimes there's like testimonial evidence. There's different kinds of evidence. Here's a few: forensic evidence, digital evidence. What exactly does testimonial evidence, specifically in the courts, what does that mean?
Yeah, in a certain sense, it's an attempt to rein in some of the complexities to make it sort of more regulated and more sort of graspable, more manageable. So testimony in the courts, it's a bit different from ordinary world testimony for a few reasons. So one is it's under oath, sworn testimony. You've promised to tell the truth. On a Bible, or there's secular versions, but certain things follow from that. So one is if you lie, you're thereby committing a crime. In the normal world, if you're lying, you're maybe doing something wrong. Typically you're doing something wrong, maybe always, but you're not committing a crime. If you lie in a court, then you are, and you can be formally punished for perjury, for committing perjury. So that's one big difference. And the other is it's kind of very regulated what kinds of evidence is allowed to appear in court, what's admissible in court, which is this word for meaning what's allowed in court, what can jurors and judges consider. And for testimony, there's two kinds. Eyewitness testimony, the people that were there and saw what happened or heard what happened, they're often called percipient witnesses. So percipient. So maybe they heard something or smelt something. And then you have expert witnesses, the people who could explain the science, the forensic science, the DNA tests, the fingerprints, or perhaps some complicated parts of finance law or financial accounting to sort of, to see whether the books were cooked. And so those are expert witnesses. And they're very regulated kinds of evidence. So for eyewitness testimony, for instance, you're not allowed to say hearsay. Hearsay is what you've heard somebody else say. So if somebody else said the getaway car was red, I didn't see it, I'm not allowed to say, oh, well, Jones said the getaway car was red. That's hearsay. I'm not allowed to say it. It's only if I saw the car I can say the getaway car was red, or I saw a red car. And then for expert witness testimony, only some kinds of assertions are allowed. So you couldn't have an expert in phrenology, right? The science of head shape. There has to be a particularly approved science, and it has to be the non-controversial claims of that science. So it's attempts to regulate. So they're the kinds of testimony that are allowed in courts.
Interesting. So there's some kind of shift in the weight or the value of your testimony if your testimony is promised to be true. And so something about the oath seems really important. So I want to ask you more about that. Is it just that you'll be legally punishable if you lie since you're under oath? Or is it that we don't want people to break their promises in general? Or why is being under oath testimony different than not under oath testimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is just that it sort of has the effect of making people more honest, so they're not lying to cover up each other's things like that. But I don't think it actually makes people more trusting of each other, because there are norms of suspicion in the court. In courts, it's very normal to have this kind of cross-examination, and you say this, but are you sure? And well, didn't you say this before? And isn't there some tension here? And if that's true, why didn't you say it before when you were first questioned by police? So in the courts of law, there are these norms of suspicion about testimony. Whereas in everyday life, if we went around like that, we wouldn't have many friends. So testimony has these really distinctive features in both courts and non-courts.
Okay,
so,
excellent. Mm-hmm.
Ordinary life. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask you more about this before you say more interesting things. What happens when there's two people and there's a disagreement about the truth, and you've got the testimony that something's the case and the testimony that it's not? It doesn't matter if it's in the courts or out of the courts, or if they're under oath or not under the oath. How does testimony play a part in the disagreement between two people?
Yeah, so we have here these credibility clash cases, these cases where the credibility of one person is up against the credibility of another. So these disagreements, these conflicting assertions. So in these cases, and you get these a lot with these kind of, she said, he said cases about sexual violence and things like that. And so one thing that you might look at is, that people often look at actually, is demeanor evidence. Does the person seem like they're lying? How are they speaking? How are they acting? How are they sitting? Do they seem fidgeting? And I think people massively overestimate the evidential value of demeanor evidence. It comes up a lot. Does she seem to be telling the truth? In these kinds of cases, these public she said, he said cases. And I think people overestimate their ability to tell this. Partly because what makes us think that we're good at telling when a rape victim is lying, or when an accused person is lying, when an accuser is lying or an accused person is lying? It's not like we have that much experience of that, really. I think we think we do, but really, really don't. And also, what would be our check for finding out if we were wrong? So we might go around, so like I spend a lot of time on college campuses, and I think a lot of people go around sorting people, professor, just as they're walking along, professor, student, non-academic worker, undergrad, grad. Why? And we think we're reliable about this, but why? It's not like, part of why we think we're reliable is that when we're wrong, no one tells us, because we're not saying it out loud. And so we just have this kind of cycle where we think we're really good at telling people's professions by looking at them, whether a student or an academic or a professor. And it's because we're not finding out when we're wrong. And I think that we have a similar kinds of bias about believing that we can tell when somebody is lying, like an accuser is lying. But also, people might appeal to things like, well, she was fidgeting. She sort of looked a bit shifty. She was fidgeting. But of course, that might well be how people act when they're describing some traumatic experience or some horrible memory, or when they're uncomfortable, like they don't want to be describing something that they're describing. It's also very gendered. A lot of women, especially young women, fidget a lot. And so I think that this demeanor evidence, how somebody seems, is overestimated. People think they can tell when they can't. And even consistency of story. I think people overestimate the importance of that, because stories, narratives, they're often not consistent. Even about our ordinary everyday life, people remember different things or think it's important to say different things or sort of flesh out stories in different ways and then reinterpret. And there's also questions about who they open up to, who they say what in front of. And philosophers are sort of known as gadflies, you know, these kind of annoying people that go around questioning. And I sort of spent some time questioning just people, just friends, after ordinary nights of partying or having a good time. And I would just ask them what they did, what happened. And the stories are very skeletal and inconsistent, and people don't remember things that you would really think they would remember. Even things like what sexual acts occurred. You know, people that they're not telling me because they're shy, they're just not telling me because they can't actually remember. These things of like the night before. Maybe they've had a couple of drinks. And so it's really striking how much our narratives and our memory are inconsistent. And so when this is really used against rape victims and rape victim testimony, I think this is it's unfair, but it's also epistemically bad. It doesn't really follow the evidence because people's stories are inconsistent, even just for an ordinary night, let alone for a traumatic experience. I think what might be more important are when we look at these, when we give this kind of epistemic analysis of the general background facts. So when we have accusations and denials, things like, well, who has the motivation to lie? Or who has the motivation to speak? So accusations come first. So they're often called he said, she said cases, but I think that masks the fact that, you know, he said, she said, it seems like kind of the accused person and the accuser, they're kind of balanced testimonies. But actually it's typically she said, and then he denies. The accusation comes first. And so who has the motivations to speak and who has the motivations to lie? Well, the accused person will have a motivation to speak because they've just been accused. And so they have this motivation to deny whether or not they did it. And even if they don't think they're going to be believed by almost anybody, so it could be it's pretty clear case, they still have a motivation to deny. Why? Well, for their mum, for their sister, for their friends or their boss, just to sort of help retain those relationships, to have some kind of veneer of a continuing relationship. They have a motivation to deny, even if the evidence is pretty well stacked against them. But the accuser, what's their motivation? Well, usually it's just not to speak at all, because remember the accusation comes first, so nothing preceded it. So their motivation is usually to say nothing, because if they speak, then they're either going to be seen as a liar or as a rape victim. And people don't want to be seen as either one. So typically their motivation is to not speak at all. And so given that they have spoken, now what is their motivation? And typically it's to tell the truth. And so part of my research is to look at base rates of accusations. So when people do speak, are they speaking truth or are they lying? And typically, you know, almost most accusations are true by a long way. And when they are false, they tend to have very particular distinctive features. They tend to be stranger rape claims, and have these kind of very violent features, like being a gang rape with weapons on a bed of glass, on sort of, you know, glass in a back alley. These kinds of features. And when we look at she said, he said cases, they're cases where they know each other, because it's not a matter of a rape occurred, who done it. It's a matter of these two people were there, what happened. And so the things that are found to be false accusations or false rape claims, usually there's not an accusation because it's like, well, they're strangers, we don't know who did it. The things that tend to be found to be false are those stranger rapes with weapons and sort of in back alleys. But the she said, he said cases tend to be acquaintance rape, and those ones are sort of look very different from the ones that tend to be false. So looking at base rates, for instance, those are the kinds of ways that we can adjudicate. And I can certainly say more about that, about how we should sort of epistemically assess in these conflicting testimony cases.
Yeah, let me ask you a specific question when it comes to thinking about testimony and accusing someone of misconduct like sexual violence. It sounded like you were saying a particular claim, so I want to ask you if you really do mean that or not. It sounded like you were saying it's more likely that the accusation is true if a person is accusing someone they know. I want to know, is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah, it is. So when it comes to criminal investigations and accusations of misconduct in general, actually, there's two main kinds. There's the we know something happened, who done it, and then there's the we know who was there, what happened. And so that we know something happened, who done it, or it's alleged that something happened, who done it. They would be the cases like somebody's found murdered. Definitely a crime happened, but who was the murderer? But she said, he said cases are almost always not like that, because there has to have been an accusation of a person. So the person is already identified, and they have to sort of know that the accusation occurred such that they can respond. Those ones tend to be well, we know who was in the room. We know who was in the elevator. We know who was in the space. What happened? So did sexual contact occur? And if it did occur, was it consensual? And then of the sexual conduct, was there any that did occurred that wasn't consensual?
In your research, you talk about something specifically you call the she said, he said paradox. Have you already worked that in and I don't know it? Or if you haven't, what is the she said, he said paradox?
Yeah, great. So the she said, he said paradox centers on very American context of Title IX cases in colleges and universities, institutions of higher education in the United States. In fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of Title IX law. So Title IX law governs how universities should respond to accusations of sexual misconduct, so rape and sexual assault on university campuses, and it governs a whole lot of other things as well. And the she said, he said paradox is about what legal standard of proof should govern those investigations. Okay, so what's the legal standard of proof? The big famous one that everyone's probably heard of is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a very high standard of proof, and it governs criminal convictions in a lot of jurisdictions, but everywhere in the US. Very high standard. It's often glossed as sort of 95% confidence in guilt. And then you have these lower standards. Preponderance of the evidence is very often understood as 50-50, more likely than not. In Britain, it's known as balance of the probabilities. And then there are other ones in the middle too, like clear and convincing evidence, sort of in the middle between those. And there's even lower ones. There's ones like there's even the some evidence standard, which is used in prisons when people can be sanctioned in prisons, for instance. There's a some evidence standard. And there's also probable cause and reasonable suspicion governing arrest and detention of citizens by the police. Okay, so there's a connection here, the Title IX and the legal standards of proof, because Title IX investigations use a legal standard of proof, and they're used for the preponderance of the evidence. Obama brought in the preponderance of the evidence standard, that 50-50. And then under the Trump administration, it was raised so that universities can instead use a higher one. That's all the background context for the she said, he said paradox. So the she said, he said paradox says, so it says, well, what should the standard of proof be for these Title IX cases? And the heart of the she said, he said paradox is that if you have a she said, he said case, an accusation and denial, if that's all of the evidence that you have, then probably the accusation is true.
Oh, okay. So default, accept the accusation of misconduct as true.
Well, no, because all it's saying is probably.
Oh, okay. I mean, what do? You take the course to case, the case to court, and probably it's true. So does he get convicted or not?
Yeah. So it doesn't say that the evidence is high enough that we should believe it, that we should accept it. It doesn't say that we know it. It just says, look, if the only thing we need is preponderance of the evidence, that 50-50, then given the base rates, given the incentives to lie, the different incentives to lie, probably the accusation is true. And that's a really low standard.
And then what do you do with it?
Yeah. So then the problem is, if it's a Title IX case, you're forced to say, well, then we have to find the person culpable formally. Because that standard is so low, preponderance of the evidence is such a low standard. And so there's a tension between how good accusations are as evidence, because so many of them are true. The base rates are sort of like, very high, that almost every accusation is true, especially these acquaintance rape accusations. There's a real tension between how high that is, just from these generalized background facts about base rates, about which percentages of accusations are true or false, and then how low the preponderance of the evidence standard is. And so now, if the background evidence means that it's a she said, he said case, probably it's true, it just therefore has satisfied the preponderance of the evidence standard, unless there's some really good counter evidence, like an alibi. But if it's just a she said, he said case, if there's nothing else. But now if you found them culpable formally, then sanctions should occur. And if it's an accusation of sexual misconduct, then for at least some of those, the sanctions should be pretty significant. Because otherwise, why were you doing an investigation, right? If you're just going to sort of assign them extra homework or send them home for a couple of days, it seems almost kind of insulting. The university shouldn't be doing those investigations. They should just leave it to the police. So it seems like if you formally found somebody guilty of something like rape, then the sanctions should be high. It should be something like expelling the person or firing the person, or at least suspending the person. Pretty significant consequences.
Yeah, let's go back to evidence, though. Did you just hint at the idea that somebody's testimony is not that highly valued of evidence? That the conclusion is, if there's just an accusation, the testimony saying this person did this conduct, and then somebody else's testimony saying, no, I didn't, we say, well, probably it happened, but then there's no guarantee of any sanction or criticism or punishment. So is testimony not viewed as that important? It's not linked to some kind of punishment?
So I think that part of the background is that when people hear an accusation and denial, I think that we have this idea that what we should do is, oh, well, if it's just they call it he said, she said, if it's just a he said, she said case, but if it's just one person's word against another, we have this idea that means that there's a balancing, an equipoise. It's like a seesaw. They cancel each other out. And part of my own research is, and so then the idea is, well, if it's balanced one way or the other, then what we should do is nothing. We should withhold completely. We should have what's called effecticism about the case. Effecticism, fancy pants word for basically meaning like equal confidence in yes and no, 50-50 down the line. And that's seen as being kind of wise and judicious and cautious and sensible and following the evidence. And so part of my research is to say, well, if you look at all of the evidence in a she said, he said case, all this base rates and motivations to lie and who has better evidence, then it's really not balanced at all. It's not equipoise at all. It's really significantly stacked in favor of the accusation. So much stacked that it's going to satisfy this standard of proof that's preponderance of the evidence. And I think it could even satisfy higher standards of proof. I think it does.
Explain that stacking. Is it just that, like, come on, why would someone go live and tell the world she was raped? And then, like, come on, of course he's going to say he didn't. Is it just like that, or is there more to it? Or why do you think that the scale is not balanced?
Well, so partly it's that. Partly it's the base rates. Just looking at the sort of, when there are big studies done of accusations and denials, what ends up being the kind of conclusion. But it's not just that. There's also things like that some of the claims that are held as counter evidence, held as like evidence to believe that the accusation is false, are actually not good evidence that the accusation is false. So things like, well, why didn't she come forward sooner? Or why did she seem fine the next day? Or why did she retain, friendly relationships with him? And so part of my work is to look at, well, people massively sort of overestimate the epistemic value of those things, thinking, well, if she was friendly to him afterwards, well, of course it wasn't. Of course he didn't rape her, back then last year, because she was friendly to him for the whole rest of the year. And so I look at reasons why it's rational and normal and typical for rape victims to be friendly to the perpetrator afterwards. Some of those reasons are just simple pragmatic reasons, that simple prudential reasons of looking after yourself. So if the person was your father, for instance, life gets very difficult if you publicly accuse them, or even if you stop being friendly to them. Similarly, if the person was your supervisor or your teacher. or even a friend, just sort of having such a kind of impact on a friendship group, especially when it's, when you're doing something like trying to get on with your university friends, then it can be sort of very impactful to stir up those relationships. But also sometimes it's because the person doesn't realize. And so I look at the ways that there are these self-protective mental blocks where people don't realize that they were rape victims despite having excellent evidence, because of how impactful it would be to come to realize. And so looking at some of the psychology and some of the philosophy behind these self-deceptive mental blocks and why they cause people to not come forward until later or to never come forward. And I think rapists also have those self-protective mental blocks too, where they don't come to realize that they committed rape. But notice that even here we have an epistemic asymmetry. The person who was a victim, an evidential asymmetry, a difference in what we should conclude. Epistemic is just a fancy pants word for like knowledge and evidence and rationality, what we should believe. Okay, so even here with these mental blocks, we have an asymmetry. So the mental blocks of not realizing you were raped will cause somebody to not make an accusation because they don't realize they were raped. They don't speak. The mental block of not realizing that you committed rape, which is also a very understandable and common mental block. I mean, people don't want to think of themselves that way. They don't want to have to, will cause them to deny falsely. And so the mental blocks of the rape victims don't cause false accusations. The mental blocks of the perpetrators do cause false denials.
So your main point here is that if it's just she said X and he said no, not X, it's not balanced. And here's why. And you give more evidence that shows the accusation is more likely true. And then you counteract the counter evidence that is saying that he is equally as credible. I see what you're doing.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And what I don't do in any of my research is ever say something like, you should believe her. You should believe rape accusations. I never say anything like that, partly because they're not a homogenous class. There's a lot of different, they're very different from each other. Some rape accusations you should believe, some you shouldn't. But also, none of what I said has to do with belief. These legal standards of proof, like preponderance of the evidence, mean just it's a low standard. It's what is probable, what is more likely than not. And so you can think it's more likely than not, but that doesn't entail that you believe it. You can withhold belief, but just judge that it's more likely than not. So I actually don't sort of say like we should all believe, all rape accusations, or that we should tend towards believing rape accusations. Instead, I say things like, here are reasons we doubt them, but here are reasons why it's actually irrational in many cases to doubt them. We're making epistemic mistakes. It feels like we're doing the right thing by being cautious, but we're actually not. We're making mistakes of not following the evidence.
So your work is about the evidence, not about the belief.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And my last question will just be an open-ended one, that when we're thinking about testimony in the courts, is there anything that you think is just totally underestimated that we haven't already discussed?
Oh, right. Interesting.
Is there something we should be thinking about that we're not?
Yeah, I think that the significance of self-deception. I think self-deception is extremely powerful. And I think we have this idea that if we have, excellent evidence that say rape occurred, then you would form the belief, you'd make the inference that rape occurred. But it's extremely common to have these mental blocks, which by the standards of our ordinary thought and a lot of ordinary academic work just seems puzzling. It doesn't even seem possible. If you believe these things and these things entail this, then of course you form the belief that rape occurred. But that's really not how it works. And so the very first study that was done on acquaintance rape, the book was published under the title, I Never Called It Rape, because that's how common it is to not label it as rape or to realize that you were raped. And so these people would describe, and it's narrative after narrative, the person would have a knife on them right by the pillow and things like this. And there would be like force and struggling and all sorts. And the person wouldn't call it rape, wouldn't see it as sexual violence because of these mental blocks. And I can't remember the number now, but it was something like 82% in this first big study of acquaintance rape, of people would describe something that clearly met the legal standard for rape, but they wouldn't call it rape. And my own research is looking at what explains that mental block, but also over the course of a life. So perhaps people didn't call it rape at a certain point, but perhaps later recategorized it and then did call it rape. And so what explains that? So I think that I do wish that people in the courts, police officers, jurors, judges, lawyers, I wish that they better understood just how powerful self-deception is. I think that would help a lot.